Welcome! Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating explainer on a text that has literally shaped Western civilization. But right off the bat, we've got to stop thinking of the Bible as just a single, neatly bound novel. The historical sources paint a totally different picture. It's actually a sprawling, complex library. We're talking a collection shaped over 1,600 years, written by nearly 40 different authors spread across 3 continents. So with a timeline that massive, it naturally begs the question, how do we know we can actually trust the text we're looking at today? Well, we are going to trace its historical chain of custody to figure out exactly why this ancient library remains reliable. Section 1. A library, not a book. The mystery of the varying sizes. Okay, let's kick things off with a data gap that honestly surprises a lot of people. It's the sheer difference in the number of books depending on which modern tradition you're looking at. For example, if you pick up a standard Protestant Bible, you're going to count exactly 66 books. But grab a Catholic Bible, that jumps to 73. And if you travel over to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which, by the way, boasts the fullest list in all of Christianity, you are looking at 88 books. It's a massive difference, and it immediately sets up this incredible historical mystery. If this is supposed to be one definitive, historical text, why on earth are these lists so different? How did they actually get formed?
And that brings us right to a very common skeptic's premise. Dr. Kristen Swinson, our professor of religion, hits the nail on the head in our source material. She asks, considering that we don't have one original and indisputed Bible, but rather a collection that evolved over a long period of time for which evidence is copies of copies, how can I as a person believe in it? It's a completely fair critical question, right? Does this whole complex history of copies and debated lists mean we should throw in the towel on its historical reliability? Let's put on our historical detective hats and look at the actual data.
Section 2. Defining the canon, setting the historical standard. So before we can really track this chain of custody, we need to nail down 2 absolutely crucial terms that ancient historians threw around a lot. The first one is canon. Now this comes from an ancient Greek word for a measuring rod or stick. It was literally a tool used to measure things. Over time, that idea evolved to mean the standard. So whenever we talk about a biblical canon, we're talking about the exclusive list of authoritative books that ancient folks recognized as the definitive, divinely inspired standard. It's basically the yardstick for what gets to sit on the library shelf.
Now, the second key term here is apocryphal. In ancient Greek, this just meant obscure, doubtful, or secret. I know today people kind of treat it like a taboo or dirty word, but in the ancient world, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing at all. Apocryphal simply referred to literature that lived outside of that established canon. It just denoted a different level of authority, not necessarily that the writings were totally heretical or forbidden.
Section 3. The Ancient Jewish Foundation. 22 books and 22 letters.
Let's transport ourselves way back to the ancient era. We're talking before Christianity even existed, just to see how that very first foundational canon was laid out. First-century historians like Josephus famously stated that the Jews only possessed 22 definitive books. But wait a second, if you look at a modern Protestant Old Testament, you'll see 39 books. So, did someone add a bunch of books later on? Actually, no. It's the exact same content. They are the exact same ancient texts. Back then, multiple books like the 12 Minor Prophets or 1st and 2nd Kings were just squished together and grouped to fit onto a smaller number of large physical scrolls.
But why group them into exactly 22 scrolls? Well, the ancient world was absolutely fascinated by numerology. Scribes were practically obsessed with precision. So the 22 books of the ancient Jewish canon were very purposefully grouped together to perfectly match the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. It's wild, right? But it really shows you this incredibly meticulous, highly standardized approach to preserving their core texts right from the very jump.
So let's fast forward to a massive archaeological discovery that really puts this foundation to the test: the Dead Sea Scrolls. Found buried out in the sands of the Qumran Valley, this vast library was largely produced between the 3rd century BC and 1st century AD by a super strict sectarian Jewish group called the Essenes. Think of this library as essentially a giant time capsule for ancient textual authority. And what's super fascinating is the data we actually find inside this time capsule. Books like Exodus, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, they are highly quoted as definitive scripture. But get this, the foundational book of Genesis is never explicitly quoted with the formal phrase "as scripture says." And the book of Esther? It is literally completely missing from the entire library, no trace of it. Does that mean these weren't canon? Well, historians warn us against relying on arguments from silence. The source material gives a fantastic analogy here. Marco Polo traveled all the way across Asia and never once wrote about the Great Wall of China in his journals. But that obviously doesn't mean the Great Wall didn't exist. A missing text or a missing citation phrase in one specific community's library doesn't just erase the wider historical consensus.
Section 4. The Early Christian Debates. The 400 years after Jesus.
As the Christian movement started emerging from its Jewish roots, the leaders had to figure out exactly how to handle all these texts related to the New Covenant. We just looked at that rigid first-century Jewish foundation. But as we move forward into the 400s AD, early church fathers started vigorously debating the exact boundaries of the Old Testament canon. And this debate, it simmered for centuries, all the way until the massive Reformation divide in the 1500s.
The real turning point in the 4th century comes down to a clash of criteria between two major historical heavyweights. We've got Jerome and Augustine. Now, Jerome was this master linguist who translated the Bible into Latin. He strongly argued for a strict canon based purely on Hebrew origins and ancient Jewish acceptance. Augustine, on the other hand, he couldn't read Hebrew. He argued that the canon should be determined by Catholicity, which basically meant wide universal acceptance across the vast majority of local churches. Essentially, Augustine wanted to count noses to see what was popular, while Jerome wanted to rely strictly on that ancient historical chain of custody.
Now, despite all these intense debates, early Christians actually organized ancient texts using a really practical three-part system. First up, canonical books. These were the ultimate authority for faith and doctrine. Second, readable books. This is exactly where the Apocrypha lived. They were seen as really great for historical education and personal encouragement, just not for establishing official church doctrine. And finally, heretical books. These were writings that were way too late, too wild, and just outright rejected. So the Apocrypha sat very firmly right there in the middle category. Super useful for sure, but simply not the ultimate standard.
Section 5. The Reformation Divide. The Council of Trent.
All right, let's fast forward a solid 1,000 years to the 1500s. Those simmering historical disagreements we just talked about, they're about to totally erupt. Let's look at the sparks that ignited the Reformation. Believe it or not, in 1517, high-ranking Catholic officials like Cardinal Cajetan were still publishing Bibles that explicitly noted the Apocrypha was meant for education only, not doctrine. But then, Martin Luther enters the scene. He starts heavily criticizing church practices, specifically the selling of indulgences to release souls from purgatory. Now, the church defended the idea of purgatory using the apocryphal book of Maccabees, so Luther pushed back hard. He revived Jerome's ancient argument, stating that Maccabees was never part of the strict original Hebrew canon, and therefore it absolutely couldn't be used to mandate core doctrine.
This theological conflict was a real game-changer. It forced a massive reaction. In 1546, at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church made a definitive, truly unprecedented ruling as a counter-Reformation measure. They officially mandated a 73-book canon, fully elevating the Apocrypha to canonical status. And they decreed that anyone who deliberately rejected these books would be anathema, which is a formal, very serious condemnation. For the very first time in history, the line was drawn in the sand with absolute, uncompromising finality.
Section 6. The Core of Reliability. The 66-Book Foundation.
Okay, so we've seen the missing scrolls, the historical rifts, and some seriously fiery debates. But what's the actual takeaway from all this source material? Well, the ultimate historical reality is that while, yes, there are different Bibles out there today, those differences lie entirely on the debated edges. We're talking about the 7 books of the Apocrypha or the expanded traditions out in the East. But right there, dead in the center, is an unbreakable, universal core. Every single tradition, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, and Ethiopian, they all agree entirely on the central 66 books. Across thousands of years of theological warfare and intense scrutiny, that central chain of custody has remained totally, remarkably intact.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Earlier, Dr. Swinson asked how we can possibly trust copies of copies that evolved over so much time. Well, when you sit down and look at the actual historical data, you see a text that was meticulously counted by ancient scribes, heavily debated by rigorous scholars, and forged to an absolute gauntlet of historical scrutiny. So if this 66-book core survived 1,600 years of all that, how does this incredible chain of custody impact your view of its historical reliability today? Something to think about. Thanks so much for exploring this amazing explainer with me, and as always, keep questioning the data.